Welcome to Building Inclusive Digital Communities with Josh Hotzenpiller and Megan Martin. Discover how that human connection actually accelerates business objectives. Get ready to transform and grow.
Welcome, everyone. We're so excited to have you here today joining us for another great conversation about digital community. And I am pleased to be joined today by Aaisha Hamid. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. And we're so excited to have you.
Very excited to be here, and you got that perfectly. Thank you.
Woo-hoo. Yes. And we are really excited to talk to you today. You've been working in the DE&I space for quite a while now. And I am just excited to pick your brain, especially as a woman coming into this space. We don't see that quite as frequently. It's becoming much more common. And so I can't wait to dive into that experience. But before we kick off, tell us a little bit about you, how you got into the space, maybe a little of your background.
Yeah, I would love to. So I am currently serving as the Assistant Vice President and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Manager at Alliant Insurance Services. We are an insurance brokerage firm based in California, but we provide services nationally. Before that, I was in the academic and legal sectors. So I started diversity work at the University of Louisville without realizing that's what I was doing. So I was involved through our diversity office in a variety of different roles. I've worked with our Women's Center and done a lot with gender equity. I've worked with our Muhammad Ali Institute and worked on racial and ethnic minority issues. And I've also worked in a couple of different places that deal with social mobility. And then I really entered the corporate world and in the workforce. I joined a firm called Hogan Lovells, which is based in DC, and we're a global law firm. And that's where I realized that it was something that more and more organizations were thinking about, because not only internally was it something that was important, it was something that a lot of our clients were asking us about as well. And so that was where I got a better chance to understand what diversity, equity, and inclusion, what that means on an operational level, and what all can be done, not just locally and nationally, but what does this work look like on a global level in Asia and in Europe? And so that was where I got a chance to experience that a little bit more. And I've always been a bit of a writer as well. So I have written a couple of books as well. My passion, cultural changes that cultivate cultures of inclusion and belonging. And so a lot of my writing deals with identities and how do you create spaces and how do you make sure that there are structures in place that are going to allow people to feel like that they are a part of it, that they're engaged, that they belong. So that's essentially where I kind of came into this world. And then eventually when I started in the US, I was doing diversity work primarily with the US and Mexico, those offices in Monterey. And then eventually, once I'd done work there as a DE&I coordinator at Hogan, I eventually moved up. I got moved to DC, which is where our headquarters were. And then I took on a global role, which allowed me to be a DE&I plan project manager and kind of oversee our efforts to integrate some of these efforts across the organization. And so it was a really great opportunity. And then eventually, once I had experienced that, I was recruited by Alliant, which brought me into a whole different industry. I think that as a whole, the insurance industry is a little behind on the diversity, equity, and inclusion front. But right now, more than ever, they're realizing the importance of it. And so we're seeing more and more efforts being done in this arena. But to me, it came across as a challenge. And I realized that the knowledge that I did have, I wanted to be able to take it into a field which was even more homogenous, right? If we're just looking at the data. And so I was like, okay, so let's take what I know. Let's think about the idiosyncrasies and the behaviors of this completely different industry and organization, and let's see how I can work together. And so my primary responsibilities right now, I help to develop, and then I'm also helping co-execute our 6-pillar data-driven, people-centric strategy right now. And just helping, I really love developing ideas and helping create them into a product and launching them. So that's been primarily what I've been doing here.
You certainly sound like a very busy woman with quite the credentials behind you. It's very impressive. And what kind of got you? It seemed like you kind of fell into this space. You said you were doing this work without even realizing it when you were at the University of Louisville. So what really interested you to follow this passion and really dive into it further?
Yeah, great question. So I think part of it is my educational background. I often tell people now that I've had a very unorthodox upbringing in that I attended a elementary school that was primarily Christian Baptist students. And then I went to an Islamic middle school where I really thought about my identity even more. And
It's a
then
culture difference, my
yeah,
goodness.
the difference is there. But I mean, the next phase, which is where I went to an all-girl Catholic high school, right, is again a
Oh my
completely
gosh,
different
you
thing.
went all over the place.
It did. And so, but that was the place that I say that's where I became very hyper aware of my identity because I'm older. And I think in that phase when you're a teenager, you're really already thinking about identity. And because I had started out in an Islamic middle school where everyone is thinking and there's nothing that's really questioned. When I went into that high school, everything about my identity was questioned. I was one of very few racial ethnic minorities, and I was the only Muslim at the time in the school. So I had a lot of questions asked, like, okay, so why do you believe in this? Well, why? Right. And so it really helped me get a better understanding of identity. One, it also made me realize what it feels like to be the only in a room, right? That was my first experience before we get into the workplace of what that feels like. And so I just really fell in love with being able to be in these kinds of spaces and to represent. And so this idea of representation, which is what I think is a cornerstone of diversity, equity, and inclusion. To move the needle forward, you want to make sure that there's equitable representation across the organization. That I think is where my passion started. And it led me, like when I went to college, I was a part of these different organizations that had nothing to do with my identity. And then eventually in the workplace, when I realized you could do this for a living, that's what I ended up wanting to do.
That's awesome. And you're certainly quite the disruptor. I mean, walking into a space that really hasn't changed much. The insurance industry hasn't really changed all that much in the last couple of decades. So you're very much disrupting an industry prime for needing a good disruption. Absolutely love that. So leading on that disruption, like how do you attract and empower diversity? What about these projects that you're working on really focus and harness that, not just within your organization, but potentially disrupting a larger industry?
Yeah, I love that you say that. This idea of disruption, it's change management. And like the word itself, disrupt, right? No one wants disruption, right? We're creatures of habit. And I like to say that organizations are the same. They're also creatures of habits. They have behaviors, they have specific characteristics. And so when you go in there,
don't fix it kind of saying.
Exactly. So when you go in, then you're like, well, I like this habit, but I think this could be worked a little bit differently, right? Like, this isn't really what we're looking for. It creates a level of reticence to move forward. And so that's why I think one of the first things I always talk about is data, being able to understand before you can attract and empower underrepresented people or really disrupt anything, you want to make sure that you have a strong basis for wanting that change, right? Not just wanting it, but needing it. So you have to make a case for it. And that comes from collecting data, both quantitative and qualitative, because you want to be data driven, but you also want to be people centric. I think there's a lot of conversation we can get into about how we need to, the human way and how we want to focus on people. But that's what I believe is the first thing that you need to do is to use your data, your diversity demographic information, do conversations across the organization at different levels to identify the pain points and use that to help guide the disruption, right? Then you meet with the relevant stakeholders, you tell them why it's important, how it can benefit them. You have to find a lot of commonality. You have to be very personable, I think, in this space and be able to connect with people and understand people at a psychological level. And I think that's how you end up disrupting, right? Like once you find that basis, you figure out those connections. Once you get that buy-in, especially from the top down, I think it makes it relatively easier to start talking about ways that you can change systems to create different results. And so I think when that happens, you're starting to see more representation at different levels. People are staying. And I think that's what attracts people into the organization. You're able to attract them is that when they're seeing that there's equitable representation across the organization, it's reflective of the people that our organization is serving. And they're going to realize that, oh, we have a chance here. We can potentially move into these leadership roles because there's people like us that are in these roles. So that's how I think you attract underrepresented people. That and also having a strong brand, like not just saying things, but actually having things to back it, walking the walk as well. Because a lot of times I think we say a lot of things as organizations, but there's no evidence of that. There's no representation or otherwise any action being done. So I think those two things really attract people. And then you mentioned empowerment as well. So what do you mean by empower underrepresented people?
Yeah, I just am curious of, so a lot of what we're talking about is equity, essentially, and giving everyone equal opportunity to participate in the space. But then not everyone always feels comfortable. They have a seat at the table for the first time, but then maybe they don't know how to use their voice, or maybe that space isn't comfortable for them to use their voice. So then how do you empower them to bring that diverse thought or diverse idea in the space now that they have a seat at the table, they're invited to the party. Now, how do they participate and empower them to use that diversity, whether it's a racial diversity, gender diversity, whatever it might be? How do you empower them to use their voice in that inclusive space?
Yeah. And that's a really great point. And I think what you're talking about, without realizing it, is you're talking about inclusion and belonging, empowering people to feel safe. That's psychological safety, where they feel like they can express themselves, they can take risks, that they can innovate. So I think that in order to do that, in order to cultivate a culture of inclusion and belonging so that people feel comfortable doing all this and offering their insights, it all, again, starts by understanding the organization as a whole, and also making sure that there's accountability mechanisms in place. If you want to make sure, like the area that I've heard constantly that stops this from happening is when the message doesn't go all the way from the top to the bottom. So the area that it always gets stuck, that I've noticed in my experience, is middle management. So if middle managers of management doesn't understand the importance of this, of cultivating this kind of culture, then it's not going to actually happen. And a lot of the people at the bottom, and especially employees entering into the system, they're not going to be able to feel that level of comfort to express themselves. And so a lot of it starts by, one, what we talked about earlier, the data, and making sure that organizationally you have the structures in place that aren't going to penalize people for being themselves and for expressing themselves, or what you said, empower, right? But the other piece is making sure that leaders are also open to this, that they understand the importance, that they're bought in as well. So that way they're allowing their direct reports, they're leading meetings where they're allowing their direct reports comfortability to be able to express themselves, and that they're fully involved in this process. Because even if you have all the structures and the data and everything in place, and you have the top leadership on board, if you don't have managers of people actually involved in this and understand how to run teams in a way that everyone's going to engage, everyone's going to get the opportunity to be included, you can't start on belonging. And I think it's important that we understand the difference between the two of these. Inclusion is about ensuring that you're giving people the opportunity to speak at the table. Belonging is how people feel. How heard do people feel? So those are two different things. It's an employee perception and you actually making an effort as an organization to allow people to engage.
Oh, I love that differentiator, because they are different things and they go hand in my book, because I think they just play well together. And it's nice to be invited to the party, but if I don't feel like I belong there, then it's really kind of a moot point.
Exactly. I think belonging is a more intimate form of inclusion.
I agree. And something else you said about, and I just love this, is data-driven, but people-centric. And so when we start looking at the data and using technology in this space, what kind of data points are you looking at? What systems are you pulling from to get that data, quantitative or qualitatively?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that's something that comes up a lot when we talk to our clients and other organizations as well, is, okay, sure, we have a lot of information on these different systems, and how do we consolidate this data, and how do we analyze it, right? And I think every organization is a little bit different. Within our organization, we have a recruitment system that collects data. We have primarily a lot of our data, diversity demographic data, goes into our HRIS system, our human resource information system. We also have an LMS, or a learning management system, that collects data as well. So we have a variety of different bodies and systems that collect information. And what we're really looking at is, one, how many underrepresented people are within our organization. So looking at the overall makeup of employees within the organization. And when I say underrepresented, I say that intentionally, because it really focuses on where you're at in the world, one. And two, we're not trying to say that certain groups are marginalized. We're not trying to say certain groups are minorities. They might be a very large part of the population, but in a specific industry or a specific organization, they're not represented. So when we talk about them, I'm referring to women, racial and ethnic minorities. I'm talking about LGBTQ community. I'm talking about people with disabilities and veterans. So we look at all of that information, primarily which is being collected through our HRIS system. We're looking at that not just as a whole, but also the breakdowns, right? So which areas, what is our administrative rules? What does that percentage look like? How many people are women, racial ethnic minorities, these different groups? What does that look like for middle management? What does that look like for the executive space? So we look at it across different leadership levels. We look at it across different states. Then we figure out what the populations look like in those states. So we're trying to figure out where are our pain points? Are they in specific departments? Are they in specific levels? Are they in specific spaces? And then we look at our attrition reports to see which people are leaving the most. And that helps paint a better picture overall. When we're looking at these attrition rates, looking at the exit interviews, what are people mostly saying? Who are we recruiting? Who are we giving the opportunity to be recruited? All of these numbers, I think, help you paint that holistic understanding of what is going on and where are the main issues.
I love that. And I love that you guys are segmenting out the data, not just looking at as it one lump sum. And I think as more and more organizations are going to be geographically dispersed with work from home and different opportunities to not necessarily have to work in office in a single location, that's segmenting some of that data from geographic to leadership levels, and then also the exit interviews of like who's leaving, who's coming, where are they coming from, what is that reason? I think it's really impressive, the data that you guys are using to make those human connections and have a really holistic view of what the organizations are doing when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that's impressive.
I appreciate that, because otherwise what we can get into is something that I call DE&I data storytelling, right? I think it's so easy for us as organizations to paint our best numbers and say that, especially if we're thinking about the insurance industry, we have a large percentage of women in the workforce. So we can easily bring up a strong percentage and say 75% of our women in our organization are women. But then you do what you were just saying, like you break that down and you're like, wait, but that percentage of women, how many of those are administrative roles and how many are actually in executive roles? And that's where that story starts to reveal itself a little bit more.
Yeah. And I think it goes beyond just checking the box, right? Beyond just saying, oh, we did this study, we have the data, we're making plans, we check the box, let's move on. So
exactly. I think it's moving from a compliance approach to a growth mindset.
Absolutely. Love that. So with that in mind, thinking about growth mindset and bringing these communities, whether in person, online, digitally, and using that data, let's say an organization has the data, they've dug in, they see where those pain points are. What are some of the challenges that they might have to overcome to implement some new initiatives to overcome those pain points?
Well, I think the number one thing, and I alluded to that earlier, is making sure that everyone understands and is bought in, right? Not just at the highest levels, but across different departments, that they understand that. Because depending on your organizational makeup, you may have communication silos. You may have departments that may or may not be interacting a lot with each other, and they're used to doing things a certain kind of way. So you want to make sure that everything is tied together, because that's the one thing about the diversity department. Every department has its own kind of function. Diversity hits everything. When you look at a comprehensive diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy plan, it hits every part of the organization. So I think it can get very overwhelming for some people is one thing. The other thing is to make sure that everyone is involved and that they all understand that they have a part to play, that it's not just a small diversity function of 2 or 3 people, or it's not just a diversity council, depending what organizations have in place to do the diversity work. The burden should not all be on them to do it. So having the people power, having the resources to be able to accomplish something like this, you have to be realistic about it. So I think sometimes people are not very realistic about what can and can't be accomplished when we think about the resources that are being allocated for these efforts, when we think about the bandwidth, when we think about the amount of people that are involved in this. So I think those are some of the initial, challenges that people can have. And the second piece is making sure that people are engaged. Like, employee resource groups don't run themselves. And even when you have employees that are volunteering to take this on, you want to make sure that they're supported and that these ERGs all have a budget that they can use. So I think it's just thinking about some of the nuances to when you are executing your strategy to make sure that you're being very realistic and that you're measuring it and that there's feedback loops and you're pivoting when you need to, because it can be a great idea, but if it's producing the same kinds of results, that realizing that you have to have the humbleness to go back and realize you need to pivot. I think those are things that can be setbacks initially for people.
Oh, I love that. And I definitely, when thinking about community and how it plays into DE&I things, initiatives and projects, it really does, to your point, go across the organization. And we see that a lot when talking about communities and a community as a tool to address some DE&I pain points that might be happening in an organization. It's not a siloed thing. It's not one person sort of pushing this out there and hoping that other departments are going to adapt to this new way and new thinking and being more inclusive. It really takes a lot of people. And I love that you talk about the employee resource groups having to have the right resources, because I've worked for a number of organizations in my past that said, oh, we have a pain point here. We need to address it. We're going to create these employee resource groups. And then next thing I know, I have a Slack channel or a Facebook group to go to. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But what am I supposed to do with this now? And the organizers are trying their best, but they're not enabled. And middle management, upper management essentially just checked a box and moved on. And then it never really went anywhere. So.
Exactly. And that fizzles out. Those kinds of programs or those kinds of initiatives always fizzle out if you don't have someone that's managing it. And if you're not supporting it, it's going to inevitably, that's what's going to end up happening. It's just going to fall apart.
Yeah, it just can't be a siloed type of outreach. It takes the whole village to have a community that is very much inclusive and productive to what you're trying to accomplish.
And I think that it's even more so something for us to think about, especially as one, when we moved into this remote world. And now I think when we're starting to integrate into these hybrid environments where some people are working from home, some people aren't. So you have mixtures, teams, people. And so how do you make sure that you're connecting everyone when not everyone is in the same place? So it's continuing to happen. It's things that we have to think about.
Oh, I love this conversation. I could keep going forever, but we're starting to round out our time. So one final question. If there would be one main point you wanted to make about inclusive communities, whether that's how to approach them or what they should look like, what would that be? Like if you had one piece of advice for someone wanting to step into this world, what would it be?
That's a really great question. I think one piece of advice that I would want people to really think about and consider is that when you're thinking about inclusive communities and engaging people, think about the distance bias. Think about how this kind of the environment that we're in right now, how that's going to impact everyone, and realize that there's a nuanced approach. So just always, whenever you're thinking about anything about engaging people, consider how it's going to impact everyone, right? And that's always going to give you a better understanding and provide you with insights on what tools you need to use and what considerations you need to make. Because if you just only consider yourself or a few people that are close to your affinity group, you're not going to get the whole picture and you're not going to be able to include and make everyone feel like they belong.
Oh, I absolutely love that. I think that's a great place to land for our episode today. But I really want to thank you, Aaisha, for joining us. This has been such an incredible conversation with lots of great takeaways. I mean, the biggest one for me is taking the approach of data-driven, but people-centric. So much of the world now is human-to-human connection. We've definitely missed that the last few years now that we're coming out of this pandemic. And I think we have to stay diligent in our plans and thoughts and how we relate to each other and that human to human connection, and just how we can leverage technology and data to do that is leaps and bounds from where we were a few years ago.
Completely agree. Thank you so much again for inviting me for this conversation. And I absolutely love what Juno is doing as well. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, and safe travels on the rest of your ventures. Feel free to tune in for our next episode. And thanks everyone for joining us today.
Thank you for joining us. Let this story inspire you to the serious work needed to build an inclusive digital community that makes a difference for your network and your brand. For more conversations like this one, be sure to subscribe to the show at junolive.com/podcast. Don't forget to share this show with your network so we can all learn from each other how to build inclusive communities. We'll be talking more about this episode on LinkedIn. where you'll find us under Juno Live. See you on the next episode.